Welcome to Let's Talk Better Forestry, a space for conversations about forests, the people who work with them, and the policies that shape them. We're here to slow things down a bit, to go beyond the headlines and hear from the people behind the work, in their own words. Honest, thoughtful, sometimes messy conversations, but always grounded in real experience. And welcome to the Let's Talk Better Forestry podcast. I'm Morag Paterson from Forest Policy Group, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Stuart Goodall, the Chief Executive of Confor, our first guest of 2026. So welcome, Stuart. Thank you very much for giving us your time to speak to us today. Would you like to introduce yourself, a bit about your role at Confor, and then for the audience explain what Confor is and a bit about what it does as an organisation?
Great. Well, thanks very much for inviting me on, Morag. I hope I help you kick off 2026 on a positive note and I don't just be the harbinger of disaster. Um, basically, Confor is the representative body for the private forestry and wood processing sector. So we represent everything from nurseries to manufacturers of wood products. As I said, based across the UK, but our main office is in Edinburgh. And it's a very diverse set of activities that we end up doing. Of course, as a members organisation, we do a lot with our members. Everything from local meetings, looking at technical subjects, but also, influencing ministers, working with civil servants, and actually, just the end of last year, establishing a forestry training service. So we're really there to try and look at how we can help this evolving industry be more successful.
Thank you. Yeah, and so are you seeing a lot of evolution in Confor and the industry as the world changes?
Yeah, I sort of flippantly describe the industry as like a teenager, because we're looking at such long time frames, long time frames for, especially hardwood species, but even the faster softwood species, we're still looking at 35 to 40 years, and in the past, longer. And we've not been around that long. I mean, the industry didn't really exist, say 50, 60 years ago. We planted a lot of forests and then sort of walked away and then waited until they matured. And then off the back of that has become the availability of timber to create a lot of downstream jobs, but also pay for investment in research and innovation and improvement. And then an whole ecosystem of businesses then evolving to assist and work with the sector, so looking at anything like drone technology or looking at new products and new innovation. And, it's all happening, over the last sort of 20 to 30 years in the time frame that I've been involved with the sector. And there's a lot more that we can be doing, which would be really interesting to dig into. So that means there's huge opportunity, but also we're still sort of learning how to find a way in the landscape. There's a lot of established sectors out there, for example, agriculture, and we're the new kid to an extent on the block still, who are looking to expand, looking to be part of, the key industries within Scotland, including and especially in a rural context. And we're finding our way. So, and like a teenager, we sometimes are seen as being a bit troublesome and a bit, you know, coming along and upsetting things. But we're, well intentioned, and I think we've got a great offer. And so I find it incredibly exciting, even after all the decades I've spent in the sector, about what the future holds for the industry.
Yeah, that it's a really interesting framing, actually. The idea that first of all, that it's a teenager and that obviously it's continuously evolving. I've not kind of heard it like that before, and it could give people a really different perspective on how they view the industry, because we tend to think of things as sort of static or set in stone and the way we do things, and there's no change coming. So it's really interesting to have that other angle. And one of the other things we said beforehand that we'd talk about, and it seems like a good time just with the way the conversation's gone there, is how we could do more with Scottish timber, in terms of innovation and new markets, etc. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The driving force behind the creation of most of the forests that were planted in the 20th century was simply about fiber. I mean, I remember when I worked for the Forestry Commission in the late 1980s. If somebody wanted to create a new forest, the expectation, if not the requirement, was that you would plant every square inch of the land that you had, and you try to get as many trees growing as quickly as you could. And we looked at, what were the most fast-growing trees, would produce the most timber, survive best in that site. So it was all very much about just creating a fiber resource. And obviously, that didn't deliver wider benefits. We didn't think necessarily about all the markets that might use that fiber. A lot of it was just about, well, what did we use timber for in the past, and how do we want to grow our own resource rather than import it? But the upside of all that has been we've been bequeathed a significant resource and knowledge about that resource. Um, and then the opportunity to be able to say, okay, well, how can we now find other species that we can use? How can we use that resource in different ways? So we have things like cross-laminated timber, glulam products. How can we understand the properties of the timber so that we can have it not just being used as pit props, which was the original concept in the beginning of the 20th century, into building houses, with Scottish timber. And we can do all these things, and that gives us a fantastic basis on which to support that innovation and to see small businesses, establishing like a Highland Heritage near Aberdeenshire, Macar, been around a bit longer, who are taking Scottish timber and saying, how can we put this into really high value, bespoke housing and such like. So, I mean, there's just so much opportunity and potential there. And I think there's definitely the enthusiasm to be able to say, how can we look at Scottish timber? How can we, I mean, I say Scottish timber, all types of timber, and how can we then see it being used more often and in higher value purposes?
Mhm. For sure. And is there, in your opinion, is there enough resource, financial and sort of human support resource going into that developing of those markets and strategies and new innovation, or is there more work to be done there?
Yeah, I mean, what we're putting into it is very small. I mean, ultimately, um, there's a realization in my mind always, and I think it's difficult often for people in the sector to become frustrated that we're not the biggest sector in Scotland. We're not the biggest sector in rural areas, and therefore governments are not going to drop everything else to throw people and money and resources into the forestry sector. And the sector itself is not a it's not a high margin, wealthy sector overall that can, make available tens of millions of pounds to invest in expensive research programs and innovation. So there's no quick fixes, I guess, is what I'm trying to convey. I think, but we do have the opportunity to make use of the people that we have. And there's a lot of experience and knowledge in the public and the private sector. And there's new people coming into the sector who are bringing new ideas and new innovative thinking. So a guy up at Highland Heritage who I met back in, I think it was November time, just near Aberdeen, and he's bringing his external experience and knowledge and ideas to say, how can he use mainly softwoods, but larch and Douglas fir, spruce, and build all sorts of homes and products and new innovations that will create jobs. He's moved from two to over a dozen people, I think, over the last 3 or 4 years. So there's that on a smaller scale, and on a larger scale, we've had the three largest sawmilling businesses coming together with ourselves. So James Jones, BSW, Glennons, looking at how we can promote C16 timber, which is, classification of, the timber strength, basically, and where it can be used. And there are in house building, pretty much you can build a whole house with C16, but generally speaking, those people who are building houses or are using timber construction are specifying something called C24, higher number, higher structural classification. And it's very difficult to be able to produce that at scale in Scotland, but it doesn't need to be for the purposes that we're using it. So there, in terms of education and explanation, we're looking to communicate that. And so all these different ways, I think we're finding means to be able to say, let's get Scottish timber into more places.
And so, sort of specifically on that point about the C16 and 24, because we'll talk a little bit about the homegrown timber industrial strategy afterwards, but on that specific point, what do you feel needs to change, and what needs to change first? Is there an order that the process needs to happen in, and what's holding it up?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and it sort of gets to the heart of the fact that it's actually quite a complex issue. There's a number of different parts to it. Um, and some of it's cultural, so or business practice. So you've got timber merchants, you've got house builders, and they've just established supply chains. They're used to specifying a certain grade of timber. A timber merchant's used to importing it and feels comfortable just having one classification of timber on their shelves rather than two, because it takes up space, which they'd rather use for something else. You have a structural surveyor who was saying, if I specify C24, it's over specifying, but nobody lost their job from over specifying something. It's all these things that it's then where are you able to make an intervention that's going to make a difference? And in terms of the C16 promotion campaign, it's essentially pointing out you've got a product here that's fit for purpose. It could be, cheaper than the alternative. It's plentiful and it's got a better carbon profile. So that's, a sales point there. I'm also talking to the political parties ahead of the Scottish election, and the thing I've been saying to them is to say that there's an opportunity for government intervention here. So if you look at the government, housing estate, where it encourages affordable housing, it's got an opportunity to make an intervention. And for government, it wants to support local businesses, local jobs. It wants to see a lower carbon profile. So it's in a position to be able to say to people who are building, housing using public money, that you should have, and this is where I'm reliant on what it is, what's the art of the possible. But I'm told it is possible to put into the sort of procurement contracts here, thing of social value, which is about giving a preference to local products, to local businesses. So those are the kind of things that we're looking at there to seek to gain a stronger foothold for C16, homegrown C16 in the marketplace.
Hmm. And so that procurement guidance or directive, where would that sit? Is that with local authorities? Is it with the private sector? Where do you envisage that change coming?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it's sitting with the public sector. I mean, there's a really interesting thing for me, which is, ultimately, if you're looking at volume house builders, their motivation is to buy land, build a house, sell the house, move on. And then often the person who's buying the house, it's a starter home, so they may move on, 5 to 10 years. So there's not really anybody who's saying, how can I invest in this house for um, you know, its whole its performance from an energy perspective, for example, over a longer term period of 40, 50 years plus. But if you're delivering affordable housing, if you own housing, then these things are important. And, what we're talking about is, building in a way which will produce, housing, other buildings which are better performing from an energy perspective, which are more attractive. And because they're a more attractive environment, then people are happier. And it's on, there's research which says that uh, children who are in schools where they've got exposed timber are, more relaxed. There's more focus. There's less uh, disruption, less unwanted behaviours. So these are the kind of things that we're even, and to target those people who have that interest, that long-term interest in the building, not a relatively fleeting interest, I think is a big opportunity. And that's where the public sector has a real opportunity to work with the private sector.
Hmm. And is there, on that point about exposed timber, I mean, it's something personally I love. I've got timber all over the house. Is there evidence there to back that up that it can have a positive effect on the kind of how the kids feel and behave, or is there a bit of an evidence gap there that would be useful to do some research on?
There's research that's come out of Australia, which supports that. And it's interesting that, and one of the things that's a bit of a frustration to me as a Scot living in Scotland is that we're now seeing, England and Wales in some ways moving ahead of what's happening in Scotland, and which is maybe no bad thing because it just, encourages us to, to refocus and buck up our ideas. But in England, the Education Authority is looking at building schools with timber because they're bought into an understanding of that it's a better environment for kids. So there's definitely, a belief there, there's evidence there. And, with examples of that, that's something that can be picked up in Scotland and elsewhere.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I've noticed quite a lot of difference in the kind of news coming out of Forestry England versus what we're doing here in Scotland. It's probably a bit of a rabbit hole for us to not go down just now, but yeah. Yeah, anyone who's sort of paying attention to the industry will probably have noticed that. And it may come up in some of the topics later on, around resilience, for example. Um, but going back, I've got a couple of things I wanted to ask you but one of them flows out of something you just mentioned, which is, what you're trying to do with politicians. You've developed a bit of a manifesto ahead of the elections. I don't know if you're calling it a manifesto, but what would your top, two, three priorities be there? What would you like to see change most?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, we do call it manifesto, and on that, we've got a number of actions. The thing with these manifestos is ultimately what you're looking to do is influence politicians, not express necessarily what you want to say. And one of the things is that, public affairs advisors who say there's the right number of actions to ask for. So we have a manifesto which is sort of five key asks because five seems the right number. But um, it's been really interesting to say, what are the really key things? And I think I would flag up are that what we want uh, is government to work with the private sector to say, how can we increase the consumption of Scottish timber, as I said, of all types, and how can we deliver the planting targets that government has set? And it reflects an interesting situation that the sector finds itself in that over the next sort of 20 to 25 years, we're forecast to have more timber available than we've had previously. So that's a great opportunity. And how do we make use of that? And then we all then know that by about sort of late 2040s, 2050s, there's a rapid falling away of supply, and we're going to have less timber available than we have now. So we have two challenges. One is how do we make greater and best use of that 20 to 25 year window of timber availability? And how do we also then ensure that we're creating the forests that allow us to be able to avoid falling away and instead, hopefully, being able to deliver an increased production and consumption of timber on a longer term sustainable basis. So that's why we sort of have those two elements. Let's make more use of the timber we have, but also we need to be planting to make sure that we maintain that level of supply for the future. Because if you don't have that longer term supply or action being taken to do that, you then struggle to get the investment for the short term. And to
Yeah.
put it simplistically, if you're looking to create a new sawmill, it's like £100 million. If you're looking even just to upgrade some of these more advanced sawmills, you're looking at tens of millions of pounds.
Hmm.
And that investment has to pay for itself over a long time frame. And
Yeah.
therefore, we need that longer term action or action for the longer term as well as the short term.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the investment is huge, isn't it? And it's so difficult when you're looking at a minimum 20, 30 year rotation as well to know what the world looks like when that harvest comes round. But I'm interested there in what you're saying about there being a really good supply right now. How does that interface with the kind of stats around that we're importing 80% of our timber? How does those
Mm.
two things balance out?
Yeah, I mean, one is the fact that this is something we're in a situation we're now moving to, which is of increased supply. But I mean, ultimately, we're never going to be in a situation where Scotland, the UK, is self-sufficient in the timber it consumes. Um, we just don't have, the land area for that. And, realistically speaking, it's not a sensible objective to saying, how do we become 100% self-sufficient? But that doesn't mean that we should just sit there and say, well, it's acceptable to be 20% self-sufficient. I think there are sensible reasons why that's not a sustainable thing to do. I mean, if you look at, we're operating in as part of what else happens in the world, and globally, supply is not keeping up with consumption of timber. So we've seen an increase in the consumption of timber within Scotland and the UK and globally. Um, in large part, most recently, been driven by the fact that people understand and recognise that if we use more wood, then that can be part of our tools to achieve net zero. Um, and therefore, there's more interest in using timber in house building and construction. Um, and therefore, we're consuming more, and therefore we need to import more. But if the world is not producing enough to keep up, it puts even more pressure on forests, overseas and fragile forests that are maybe not protected. And one of the things I have seen is people saying, well, the solution is that we ensure that the UK or Scotland doesn't import illegal timber or only import sustainable timber, which is great. But that doesn't then mean that other countries in the world will then say, okay, we're not going to import illegal timber. We're not going to overcut and all the rest of the things. So we just export the problem elsewhere. I also think more positively, it's a really missed opportunity because we can improve the productivity of the forests that we have, through research, through practice. We can create forests in areas where I think it's the best use of that land in terms of the benefits it provides for society. And that's what we should be aiming to do. So there's a real opportunity to be able to eat into some of that 80% imported timber, but we're not going to even, well, at hazard to, wouldn't want to hazard a guess at what percentage we could make, but we're still going to be importing easily the majority of our timber, I would think, on an ongoing basis.
Mm. So there is a tension there, isn't there, between increasing demand and being innovative, and then knowing that that will ultimately end up in us potentially importing more, especially with the sort of geopolitical situation at the moment. Like no one could guess where we'll be even in the end of the week, let alone in 2 years or 40 years time. But so I also wonder, obviously for resilience, whether that's just being self-sufficient or for environmental and climate resilience, how much are we putting into circularity in the system? Getting more wood reused, getting wood into longer lock-up products like the housing, and is you might not want to speak about this last point, so it's fine if you don't. Is there a tension between the people whose business model is produce more and then the need to actually be looking at a market that recycles the wood that we do have a lot more?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question, and it's actually the point I was just going to, to come on to is circularity is incredibly important, and reuse and recycling. And to fold in on your final point, I think we all understand that there's benefit in being able to use more timber, but we want to make sure it does come from sustainable supplies, so that it's delivering benefits for people, for the economy, for nature. So yeah, you don't just go hell for leather and say, well, that's great, let's just increase consumption. That doesn't make sense. We start to then work against the very things we're trying to promote. So there is a high awareness and acceptance of, absolutely what we want to do is to look at how can timber be used again and again. How can it be taken out of, how potentially taken out of a house in the future to be reused, recycled. We've got things like the panelboard sector, which, are fantastic in terms of there's now almost no timber that's going to landfill because there's a market to take that waste wood and put it into panelboard products and an increase of of the usage of that. And even something as basic and humble and important as a pallet is how do we recondition wood pallets to keep those pallets being used more often. I mean, ultimately, there is an element here that the market's far bigger than we're able to provide. So there shouldn't be a problem for us in saying, okay, let's make best use and reuse of the product that we have. In fact, it's an opportunity to grow in the sector, to grow industry, to offer more jobs. So it's something that, we're really, really embracing and positive about. But again, it comes back to one of those things you said earlier. How do they make these things happen in practice? And as a relatively small industry, we are reliant on being able to work with others to be able to say, how can this best be done? How can we, look at the research, the innovation, the piloting to be able to do more of that? But there's an abundance of enthusiasm to go down that route.
Yeah, that's good to hear. I mean, are there any kind of partners in that zone that you want to be working with that you aren't yet that you can talk about? Or, is there anywhere where you'd really like to see some impetus?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound too cynical, but this is one of those things, and it comes up a number of times, in the work that I do, that at a policy level, at a political level, we'll make statements to say that something is really important and they want to see more of it. But then it's not really clear what the actions are, the pathways, the means to be able to support and make that happen. So, you asking me that question, and I've not asked myself it as bluntly as that, but in my mind, it's been, well, where would I go? There's people like Circularity Scotland, or there's others, but it's not like they're able to then say, here's a toolkit, here's a funding opportunity, here's something that you can do. A lot of it is just, you know, statements of it's really important that businesses look at how their products can become more circular. And you go, well, yeah, absolutely. We buy into that. We'd like to do that. But there doesn't appear to be obvious partners, routes, pathways to help to make that happen. And that then becomes very challenging for these businesses because, you look at even some of the businesses we view as the larger businesses in the sector, they have to be very lean in how they operate. They don't have teams of people who are just looking around waiting to have an opportunity to go and speak to somebody on the basis that it might come up with some great idea. You, there needs to be that sort of external advice and support, and I'm not sure where that is.
Right, yeah, that's really interesting. So, I mean, I'm very familiar with the delivery gap between lovely ambitions and stuff actually happening on the ground. So I kind of can relate to frustration there. So there's definitely an opportunity there, though, is what we're saying, whether it's the enterprise agencies or some other support or even private businesses coming in and starting to offer levels of advice and consultancy around that. Would that be the kind of thing that would help?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's very timely. I just last night I was at a reception by South of Scotland Enterprise in Hollywood, where they were celebrating 5 years. And there were a number of speakers, and they were talking about all the wonderful businesses in the south of Scotland and the sectors and everything else in there. There was medicinal cannabis was mentioned, but trees, forests, timber, not mentioned at any point by any of the speakers or any of the officials. And, I was standing beside somebody, from James Jones, who a previous forestry minister has said are probably on their site invested more money as a private business than anybody else has in the south of Scotland up to that point. And he is now working for SOSI, but there is no recognition of forestry and timber. We've spoken to them, we've, said to them, look, you're not doing enough here. But that just to me, and I don't know, I can't put my finger on why it is that an enterprise agency wouldn't look at the forestry sector, in this case in South Scotland, and go, here's a real opportunity. It's an expanding sector. It's got the opportunity for innovation, new products, added value, more jobs. Be able to deliver things like circularity, carbon sequestration, improving biodiversity in the existing forest that we have. All these are things that, we want to be able to do, but we're looking for partners. We're looking to, to have support and encouragement. But, the local agency, enterprise agency isn't even apparently on their radar.
I'm quite floored by that, if I'm honest, because we're such, like, it's such a huge land cover in our region. The percentage, it's, however it rates on economy versus tourism and agriculture and other things, its land cover is I can't remember, it's coming up to a third there across the south of Scotland. So on that basis alone, you'd imagine it would be, part of the dialogue at least. And I mean, what about the interface then? Because I was with your colleague Andy Leach, I think, at the convention of the South of Scotland a couple of years ago. There was myself and him and Charles Dundas talking to the two ministers in the South of Scotland enterprise kind of board and colleagues about the natural capital innovation zone and the role of timber in that. And it also seems like that natural capital innovation zone rolls off the tongue so easily would be the ideal place to be doing some of this innovative work that needs to be doing. So is that fallen a little bit by the wayside? Or I mean, obviously don't say anything that you don't feel comfortable
Yeah.
saying. It's just we can roll over this question if you want.
No, no, I mean, there are some things, that, we're still talking to them about. We set up a training service near Dumfries. Its purpose is to address areas where there are, currently market failure in the provision of training, and SOSI have been supportive of that. Um, but yeah, it it, it does surprise me. It disappoints, and I don't know whether, in part, the enterprise agencies always seem to love something new. So medicinal cannabis production is new. Talking about space and rocket technology, and you're thinking, That all sounds terribly exciting, but the number of jobs involved in it are pretty small. Um, and maybe forestry is, you know, seen as it's not necessarily new. I mean, I've talked about it being a sort of teenage sector, but we've had trees and we've been harvesting trees for centuries. It's really just the scale and the opportunity for that that's changed so hugely over the last sort of 30 years. I
Mm.
don't know whether that's part of it. If I could put my finger on it, and if you could help me, with ideas, then that would be great. But yeah, at the moment, left with the frustration.
Huh. Yeah. I mean, it seems like at the very least, the innovation zone would be the space to be giving this assistance around circularity, and some of the new innovation could diversify the products that we use, and also creating more local circular economies as well. I mean, we're going to touch on community benefit and community wealth building shortly, and maybe that's somewhere where this conversation will open up again, because obviously it's a big thing in the south of Scotland. But I wonder, before we move on to that section, is there anything about this kind of idea of a homegrown timber industrial strategy that we haven't covered already? Is there anything more you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is that, ultimately, if we're looking at how can we use more Scottish timber, then we need to be looking at both ends of the telescope, if that's the right term, or both ends of the supply chain at the same point and linking them up. Because, you were saying, how can we use, the resource we have in innovative ways, what species we have, what are future markets, and it's very difficult to say, what is going to be the market, what's the demand in 35 years or 40 or 60 years time, maybe 80 years time, depending on species. But we know that wood fiber is such a versatile material, and it's not. We've got opportunities to use it in its structural form. We've got opportunities to use it as a replacement for plastics and aviation fuels and all those sorts of things. So the opportunities are almost endless. The thing is, and people love timber. They love having woods. We've got all these advantages. So I think the thing there is to say, how can we do things like when we're creating woodlands of all types, looking at the opportunity for those to be managed and to produce high quality, timber at the end, whether it's hardwoods or softwoods, and to be encouraging more of more businesses to be looking at innovation, to be looking at ways in which we can improve productivity. And the reason for talking about this industrial strategy, timber industrial strategy, is that how we manage forests and how we create forests is determined by government policy. So that, government has to be a part of that discussion. Government has capacity through things like forest research to look at productivity, to look at resilience, to look at the properties of timber. And industry is putting funding into that, but it happens as a partnership approach, as industry can't bear the weight of all that itself. Um, so what activity takes place is based around partnership. And to be blunt, it's easier for me to ask a business to give money if it feels it's leveraging funding from the public sector rather than just trying to corral a series of competing businesses. So for all those reasons and more, and the fact there are things like skills and the role of government in terms of public procurement policy, if we can pull those things together in one strategy, then I feel it will allow us to make a step change forward in a way that we haven't been able to so far. So that's the sort of underpinning idea, concept under the industrial strategy. If it's adopted and then developed, how it then appears, that's going to be a process. But I feel that if we can make that happen, then that's going to be really beneficial for businesses, forests of all scales and sizes and all types.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I know I'm a bit south of Scotland biased, obviously, because that's where I'm from. But it does seem, going back to the previous conversation, that, would a regional pilot report on some of this help, potentially kickstart it? So the problem isn't so huge that no one feels ready to look at it, or the opportunity, is
Mm.
also huge because we've got so much forestry down here. So, maybe that's the kind of direction would be possible to go in.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and it's interesting. I think it's it's South Scotland's got such a concentration of the resource and businesses making use of the resource and an opportunity to create more businesses of different scales to make use of the resource that we have that yeah, you'd have thought there was a reason there if there was an industrial strategy in the offing that Sozi was saying, yeah, we'd like to play a leading role in that. We'd like to be able to pilot this and shape it because it's something where we can benefit from it and also help shape it.
Yeah, yeah. It's also perfect timing because both the Borders and D&G, Dumfries and Galloway, woodland strategies are being reviewed this year. So it's the
Yeah.
perfect time to not wait till those strategies are in place and not being renewed for another 10 years, to be at
Mm.
least pulling together what we can, from all of this into even just regional policy. So it's an interesting
Mm.
time for sure to be looking at it all.
Yeah.
Okie doke. I want to move on to talking about communities a little bit, but just as a little break between that part of the conversation and the next bit, I had one for you that's a bit quicker, maybe, which is like, what do you think the biggest misunderstanding about the forestry sector is, and what's the fairest criticism
Mm.
that it does need to own?
Yeah. I mean, I think most of the sort of misunderstandings that I come across in my role and for some time has been a sense that the forests that were planted last century are what forestry is about now. And I mean, it's interesting that a number of conversations I've had where somebody said to me, sometimes on the ground and sometimes just elsewhere, and said, I don't want another forest like that, or I don't want the forest that I see at home, and I say, well, neither do I, and people are surprised, and the perception is that's what forestry is if you're looking to produce timber, and that's all that's on offer, and the and I understand that, to a large extent, because ultimately it's easy to look at something and go, well, that's a squarish single species monoculture. It's never been thinned. It's now often it's getting pretty old and, it's dark, forbidding. And when it comes to being harvested, it's all going to get flattened at one time. And that gives the perception of what forestry is because that's what people can see. Whereas trying to come along and then convey a picture to somebody of a very different reality is incredibly problematic, really difficult. When we've got some areas of forestry which are going through that redesign process, and then people can go there and start to see that it is more varied, that there's longer term, tree retentions, there are noise from birds and flora and fauna and things like that. But I can't persuade everybody to come out with me, and I don't have the time to take everybody out, or myself and my colleagues. So I think that's the root of a lot of of the misunderstandings. He would then sing about owning you know the things, and I think it's important that as an industry we've owned the fact that the forests that were planted last century are not the forests that we should be maintaining or creating new ones. I mean, they provided fantastic base resource of fibre and timber, which has led to the formation of so much of the businesses in the industry we've got in Scotland. But ultimately, you know, we recognise that those forests can offer more and should offer more. And especially when it comes to new woodland creation, this is something, as I say, it's driven by government policy. Government funding makes it happen. You can't do anything other than accept that, well, you then work with the societal expectations which underpin that policy. Um, and that provides a driver. But I also think, looking around the sector, there is a pride being taken by the people who are creating the woodlands now that it isn't just about timber and timber productivity. And those things are incredibly important. It underpins the provision of so many of the other benefits that those woodlands provide. But there is real pride in saying, okay, well, these forests are places for flora and fauna, they're places where people can come, and I'm sure we'll start talking about that, but also that people in the local community look at it and hopefully in time, even if they didn't like the fact it was being planted, they will come to view it as positive in the future. And I think that is important to the people who are creating these woodlands. And that's you know, I would hope comes from owning an understanding of the drivers behind the forests of the last century and the fact that they're not the forests that we should just be simply repeating, that we have a responsibility and an opportunity to take pride in forests now. So that took some time, for people to sort of own that, yeah, those forests, that's what we're used to, but they're not the forests of the future.
Yeah, yeah. It's just made me wonder while you were talking there if you have any thoughts on continuous cover forestry, because there's a lot of discussion going on about that at the moment and the benefits and how it can also be, is just as commercially productive, and also have some of the other knock-on benefits. Have you got what do your thoughts, or what do you think the industry, the more commercial side of it, is thinking along those lines?
I mean, ultimately, one of the joys of my job is I get to speak to lots of different people, and in forestry there are lots of enthusiastic individuals, with often guided by what's really interesting and important to them, and that can lead to all sorts of really interesting conversations. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what I look at is how can I look into that, have those conversations and sort of understand, well, what does that mean in certain contexts? Um, and I try and do that job as best I can. And if I look at CCF, for me, I've seen, stands of CCF. I've got members, for example, in Southern England who've been practicing CCF for some time, and those forests are fantastic. I mean, you walk around them, you know, they're producing timber, they're profitable, there's fantastic wildlife, the pride that the woodland owner and the managers or agents take in it is inspiring. It's absolutely fantastic. Uh, but then I sort of also look at it from, as I was saying, on the other end of the telescope. We need timber products in society, and I believe timber products can be transformational in a positive way for society. But that means having timber products at scale, and we've also then got to be cost competitive. At the end of the day, as we're saying, 80% of the timber products are imported. We're not going to put up Trump-like tariffs and say, we're we're going to onshore our timber, and equally, wouldn't make sense for the reasons we discussed. So out of all of that, and hopefully I'm coming to a sensible point through that ramble, is that I look at it and think, well, there are areas in Scotland where the soils, the weather conditions would allow you to do high quality CCF. And if somebody can take that on and make that work for them, absolutely, all power to your elbow. That's brilliant, and I'd really encourage that. I don't see CCF becoming the underpinning management regime for producing the volumes of timber that we require on a commercial, cost competitive basis. So it's very much, at the end of the day, horses for courses. That's where we are now. But I think we should absolutely be having that dialogue. We should be looking at, what we can do. There are really interesting people, and Andrew McQueen, who you spoke to before, looking at these things. Really intelligent, switched on individuals with a commercial mindset there as well. And I think that's where there's a real positive opportunity. But what we need to do is be, led by the evidence and, take it forward. And, it comes back to that point so many times. We're looking at 40 to 80 year rotations here. We can't suddenly say, well, let's make a policy or political decision in 5 years' time, turn everything upside down. But equally, we should always be looking at how we can do things better.
Yeah, yeah. And don't worry about taking a while to get to your answer, because part of the point of this podcast is so that we do get people's thought processes and the ideas behind their beliefs as well, because that's what we so often miss, don't we, in the sort of polarized world that we live in across all areas, not just forestry. So, I enjoy hearing it, and I'm sure the audience does as well. It does seem like it's a really good point now, though, to ask you the question that the last interviewee left for you, Alan McDonald, because it kind of follows on from what you were talking about there a little bit. So I'll read it verbatim. A lot of apparently contradictory evidence is quoted in relation to the pros and cons of different types of forestry. How can we get past our often tribal interpretations of evidence to a shared understanding of the challenges and the tools we have for addressing these?
That's a really good question by Alan, and the next time I see him, I'll congratulate him. Um, I think the key thing is that I think Alan's point about polarized positions, the starting points. I think because people have very specific perspectives which they're coming to the evidence from, they're then looking to interpret the evidence, or they're looking to select the evidence which then supports the argument they have. And then what that then often means is that the people that they're looking to use that evidence against, and I use that word quite deliberately, are then defensively saying, well, how can I interpret that evidence or look to cut the evidence which, supports my argument? And interesting, just in the way, you're commenting on the conversation in the podcast and the longer form conversation is those interactions are then summary interactions where you're just basically saying, this is the output of my thinking in a very specific statement. And you're then not able to dig beneath that and say, well, actually, are we closer in our thinking, or can we find ways to make some of those connections and where we're coming from to find common ground? And I think that's the thing we often miss in forestry is this ultimately there's this, descriptions, and a lot of it's historic, between commercial forestry or native woodlands or rewilding, and a sense that there's a spectrum. Many others have said this before, so nothing new on my part. A spectrum, and you're either at one end or the other. Whereas, when I worked for the old Forestry Commission, what's now Scottish Forestry, at least in Scotland, I was involved in developing the UK Woodland Assurance Standard, um, and getting all these stakeholders around the table. And what was a really complex and challenging activity. And I supported them, worked with a guy who led on that and then took over running it. And it was that simple sense of, yeah, there are, we broke it down in those days and we still do economic, environmental, social. So immediately it's not a linear set of extremes. It's three sets of interests. But then you can overlay that with all sorts of other interests and outcomes and outputs. And I think the key thing for me is that it is complex, but we also are able to deliver a range of outcomes in every woodland. And it's really about how do we dial those up and how can we dial one up that's particularly important in one area without having too much of a negative impact on some of the other activities. And where can we actually dial up two or three of these things at the one time? And we can do that. And that I'd link that back to the point I'm saying about being in a teenage sector. We're still learning so much of how we can do this in a Scottish context. We don't have hundreds of years of experience of working with the kind of forest that we have, or we seek to create or recreate, to be able to say, how can we do that? But I do believe we're going to come up with better solutions if we have a dialogue around it and we don't just end up only meeting at certain points where we're saying, how can I make a statement in summary to try and defend my position against the criticisms that are being thrown at me? So
Mm.
that would be my long full answer to Alan's point.
Yeah. Yeah, so money more spaces for dialogue. And obviously we've seen that in other aspects of land management in Scotland, like the mediation that's gone on with the deer management, and the kind of progress that that's making. And it's something that, could happen with the timber industry and other sectors as well. And that, well, it leads me really neatly on to talk about, I wanted to ask about the community engagement guidance mediation that both you and myself worked on. Gosh, is it a couple of years ago already? I think it came out last year, didn't it? So, do you want to explain what that process was for people who won't be aware, and also some reflections on how the process went and what the outcomes of it are? And perhaps even then saying, could a similar technique or a similar forum or workshops be used to negotiate around other areas of forestry?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, the genesis for me was the fact that you know, government wants to encourage an increased level of woodland creation. So that automatically then leads to more instances where there's change, land use change. And in certain cases, that can become concentrated in areas where it's seen this particular opportunity to to plant certain types of forests, and then there's accelerated transition in particular areas, and you're seeing there, what we've seen in the past, but perhaps through social media and all the rest of it, there's um, a greater opportunity for people to be able to say, well, there's change happening here, what's going on, I'm not happy, and for that communication to come together. And, that's perfectly natural. And it's life as it is, and it's not a bad thing. Um, I mean, ultimately, communities being coming together and working together is a positive thing. I think the thing which was really interesting for me was when yourself and a group of other people actually took time, came in and had a chat to say, is there a way in which stakeholders, communities can be listened to better as part of the process of consulting on a new woodland creation project. And it wasn't my idea. I can't remember which one of you or your colleagues it was, but it was, it would be really useful, that conversation to develop a good practice guide. And, alongside that, we've also then subsequently created training program for foresters. And those things for me are important and to happen alongside each other because essentially, there's a number of people probably heard me say this before. In my experience, foresters are interested in forestry because they want to be around trees and not around people. And then we say, stand up in front of angry people. And, they feel uncomfortable, intimidated, by that. And equally, people can feel angry and frustrated because they don't understand what's going on. They feel that things perhaps happening they're not aware of, or they've been kept in the dark. There's forces which are acting against their interests, which they're not aware of. So having that, that transparency around the process, that there is communication about, yeah, the person who owns this land is, looking to create a forest. This is the kind of thinking that sits behind that. What's the time frame? You will be consulted. These are the points you'll be consulted. If you don't hear, that's not because things are going on in the background you're not being aware of. These there's just the periods of silence, and then giving the foresters, the people leading the projects, the confidence and the skills and the tools to be able to say, how do I feel comfortable now about conducting good engagement? And for me, it's if those people who are being, consulted have greater clarity, have an understanding that there's a process and that views are important, are now going to be listened to, and there are people then who are developing the projects who've got that greater confidence and a sense that, well, look, if you follow this good practice guide, you'll have a better conversation. That at the end of the day, hopefully, what we should have is better outputs and people and all parties to that feeling happier. So I think that good practice guide has been a tremendous piece of work. And, hopefully the training is, well, I'm, I'm not good at saying positive things about things I'm involved in. I think that's my background. But the feedback we've had, delivered over 200 uh, training, or 200 over 200 people have been involved in the training, from the public sector as well as the private sector, although primarily private sector. And over 90% of the people who've been on the course have rated it as excellent, which is quite remarkable in those terms. And I think it points to a fact that there's a desire to do all this well and to be able to do it better. And people feel passionate about forestry, and obviously people feel passionate about how forestry paints up, their local communities and landscapes. So I think we've been able to step in there and begin to make a difference. Um, I don't know. What I would really love to do next, and I need to find the time and a means to be able to do it, is to say, how can we formally review the impact of that guidance? To be able to speak to people who are using it, whether they're somebody being consulted or whether they're working in the public or the private sector in forestry, to then say, what's your experience? And, can we, adapt it, develop it, with the training, how's that working? Is there more that we could do here? But a sort of last thought from me uh, is that what I really welcome is having worked for the regulator, for the government, and then worked in the private sector, is that there can often be just an expectation that Scottish Forestry now, whenever there's an issue, that Scottish Forestry should step in and sort it out and come up with a solution. And those consultation processes become very formal, and there's a very formal consultation mechanism and assessment process and all the rest of it. Whereas what we did is we got people, knowledgeable people, people who felt, strongly, but were also able and, keen to work constructively together to say, what is it we're trying to achieve here? And we've got this shared understanding and shared outcome in mind. And then through an external facilitator, we're able to, build that sort of trust, that confidence, that those conversations. And as a result, we come up with something which, um, I've had so much positive feedback from everybody from, cabinet secretary, ministers, through Scottish Forestry, and people in the forestry sector and elsewhere. Anybody who's ever spoken to me about it has said we've been very positive. It'd just be nice to be able to have something which is a bit more structured than Stuart says. The conversations these have with people have been really positive. That's great. Let's move on. But that for me has been really fantastic, and absolutely pay testament to to yourself and the people you came with, who came and said, look, we feel strongly about this, but we'd like to talk to you about how we can do things better. And yeah, it's one of the things I really take a lot of pride in being part of that.
Mm. Well, thank you. Yeah, and obviously, there's an appreciation of you being willing to bring that forward as well, and it's obviously taking a bit of a risk to go into a process like that. Um, but on my part, it was so interesting to be in the room with two, let's call them opposing sides, and a bit of tension as everybody first arrived, but then to find out how much you actually have in common when you have those longer conversations again.
Mm.
So yeah, it's been good, and I'm glad to hear that it's landing well, kind of in the real world, because it's all very well doing the theory, isn't it? And it would be great to see, yeah, like you say, some evaluation without it necessarily being overly formal, even just testimonials from the foresters and maybe some from communities would be really interesting, wouldn't it? Mm.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. Because I mean, ultimately, there's a sense that it's made a real positive difference.
Mhm. Mhm.
But
Mhm.
equally, it's good to get feedback from people who've worked with something.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah,
have suggestions for how to evolve it and keep it fresh, because these things should never really be static anyway, should they? As you said,
yeah,
the industry's changing, the world's changing. We need to stay up to date. Yeah. Well, that leads us to I know we've been going for quite a while, but if you've got time, I would like to touch on what your thoughts are on local community benefits and community wealth building. So just for the audience, we're not talking about the wider societal benefits of carbon and timber supply and national level jobs. We're talking about benefits in and around the forest, the new ones and the existing ones. Yeah, so would you like to talk to that a little bit?
yeah. I mean, I think I mean, it's a really interesting area because there's I mean, government obviously, Scottish government wants to see all sectors delivering, local benefit in rural areas. I mean, rightly or wrongly, I look at sort of community wealth building as often being more of a sort of rural focus. But that's so if I'm looking at it through that lens, and governments quite bluntly, we're saying we're giving you public money as part of the funding required to be able to create a new woodland. So we would like to see certain outcomes, certain outputs for that. So there's definitely that backdrop that we're very aware of. Um, but in the spirit of these things and other things I've said, I think the important thing is if we're just looking at something and saying, oh, well, there's a requirement there from government to jump through these hoops in order to carry on getting the funding that you have been, that you're not approaching something with the right mindset for it to actually then deliver real benefit. And I guess that comes on to the point where I'm a bit hesitant myself to sort of say, what are the community benefits? Because, at the end of the day, it's for the community to define what's important to them, and that's going to be different in different places. I think the thing that we're looking at, within Confor is how can we inform and support the businesses in the sector to understand that there is this, there's this expectation, but it's also an opportunity. And how can you, engage with communities in an appropriate and effective way so that you're able to, identify what those benefits and opportunities are. In practice, I think a lot of them may already be happening, and people are not necessarily, aware of that. For example, in terms of access or the significance for local jobs. But there will be other things that haven't currently been considered. And I mean, I'm really pleased to see that there are a number of organizations who are already doing things in this space. And a couple of times I've been out um, with Foresight, at Glaister's Bridge. You've got McNabb, Laurie there, you know well. And, it's just been fantastic to see the way there was that positive conversation. So you've got the person creating the new forest who's saying, yeah, we're open-minded to having a conversation. And then somebody, effectively, being a facilitator for the community to be able to say, yeah, well, let's look at this where are the opportunities in this? Where is it that if we go and approach, the owner of the land in a positive way and saying, what we want to do is to work constructively with you on something that has real value, that it's unlocked, something of which I know the people at Foresight are hugely proud of and thinks a great outcome, and which the local community value and believe they now have an improved resource available to them. That's a real win-win. And yeah, it's always, isn't it? You point to where it's gone really well and saying, that's the way you'd like to be everywhere. And it's not going to be as straightforward as that. But I think that's the aspiration, is to say, how can we support, we as Confor support businesses in the sector, landowners, to be able to say, there is a way to do this. You might be hesitant, you might be nervous, worried, anxious about, where it might, what it might lead to. But, there are ways to do it. And there's experience in the ways of doing it, which can be very positive for yourselves as well as the community. So I think that's the space we are now. And it'd be nice potentially in future to, if necessary, perhaps sort of come up with something, like another best practice guide to this kind of thing. And that might be, a way forward. At the moment, I think we're in the phase of, as I said, trying to raise awareness and say, this can be a positive thing if, if you approach it in the right way.
Yep, yep. And we've got McNabb coming on next, hopefully. So we'll be talking to him about the Glaisters project and the relationship with Foresight around that as well. And I think it's, what I've been struck by that project is that a relatively simple offering, saying the community can lease a bit of land, so there's no ownership involved. We don't need to go to the binary of this is the private bit and this is community owned. The fact that they've got that lease, which gives them some control, a sense of ownership and agency, has really flourished in what that community is able to do in and with that space. So quantifying some of that beyond what initially happened, but also maybe making some sort of template or blueprint so not everyone has to go through the whole legal research of how that might work. Um, would be really helpful, I guess. And also, so it is that chicken and egg situation, isn't it? If we need case studies to give people the inspiration of what can happen, but yeah, some people will just have to like bite the bullet and use their imagination. And it's like you said, which is very important right at the beginning of your answer, is that there isn't a one size fits all. You can't just say this is what we do. I mean, because the wind industry do that to an extent, but the financials are very different in the woodland sector, as far as I'm aware. So you can't just say we're giving you all 5,000 per megawatt or X amount per tree or carbon unit or whatever. It's going to need to be worked through on a site by site basis, and different communities have different assets as a starting point, don't they? And so yeah, and of course that there should be room for local imagination as well, which is where we'll see the most exciting things happen, I would imagine, rather than the kind of tick box um, approach. Yeah, so I'm really excited about having that conversation with McNabb and then and seeing what unfolds over the next couple of years as the sector sort of takes this forward really. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I'm really interested to see what he says. I think,
Hmm.
ultimately, there's so much pressure, around woodland creation, to be able to create something, and the opportunities are often, around woodland creation at scale, and that's where it can provide sometimes quite considerable community benefit. But they're also the most complex planting schemes, which can often create the most complex consultation processes and then lead to long time frames, and everybody becomes a bit jaded and just wants to get over the line. And I think, the interesting thing I've seen where it's worked really well is that, communities have, dug into it and looked at it and thought, well, what is important to us? What is it that somebody as a woollen owner can provide, simply? Because the more complex, the more legal, and all the things, the more difficult it becomes. But it's still has real value. And I think you put your finger on it there with Glacis Bridge, where it was, sometimes people say, well, we want to own that bit of forest. We want to have that bit of forest transferred to us because ownership gives us a sense that we can then do something with it. Whereas in Glacis Bridge as well, owning land then comes with a huge amount of responsibilities and exposure to risk and all the rest of it. And therefore, actually, having a long lease gives us the ability to achieve more and at a lower risk. And that's a better outcome. And I think it's that kind of how can look at it and come to the woodland owner, their agent, with ideas which are valuable to the community, but are also the easier they are to be able to deliver, the more likely they are to happen when it comes to that sort of, the existing forest and access or making use of an area of land or whatever. So that's the thing I think, is really encouraging for me where, and I understand that that's something that my NAB's keen to do, which is to offer that kind of service, to be able to use the experience to be able to say, yeah, how can we make these things happen in a way which is allows more things to happen
Mm.
because we're approaching it the right way and we're approaching it in an informed way.
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't have to have the entire answer or the entire vision of what that looks like. You set the stage and make the space for it to happen, right? As in, yeah, which makes it a lot easier for everybody if they can just get over that initial hurdle of fear and anxiety over how it might pan out. Because I do detect that, the more people come into your forest, there's more sort of risks of litter and fire and things, and we need to find easy ways of getting across those hurdles. What do you think the opportunity is with the existing woodland cover, though? Because in a way, that should be easier to build in community wealth building, although there's not so much of a carrot and stick there because, someone's not looking for consent necessarily, except when the management plan comes up for renewal, I guess. And also, but also, there must be a lot more case studies already of how existing forests are providing opportunities. So, do you think there's more work to be done there?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it, harks back to the point I was saying, we established a forest resource, we Scotland established a forest resource quite some time ago for a very simplistic perspective, and then all the forests were designed in that way, and we didn't even put in things like roads and access. Like we planted forests in places that we now can't access. It was just all a rush to get trees in the ground wherever we could. But what that then bequeaths us is the opportunity to say, well, here's a resource that can be redesigned to deliver so much more. And not every woodland owner is the same. So I wouldn't say that if you spoke to the local woodland owner, they're sitting there, with the kettle on, saying, "I've been waiting for you to come round. Let's have a conversation about what you want." But there are people I know that I work with who will go, "Well, yeah, you know, we really enjoy having people using our forest. It's good to see people enjoying the forest, walking, cycling, whatever." And it comes back to that point that you were saying, which is essentially about responsible use. If people feel that somebody is going to come and enjoy the forest and they're not going to damage it, then that's a positive. And a lot of woodland owners are very happy to look at that and say, well, actually, how can we facilitate that? And if we can guarantee that as much as possible, I think there are big opportunities there to be using the existing forest.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear. It's encouraging. I mean, and who would take that forward? Like, what would be the next step in a mechanism of trying to make that happen? Is it the job of Scottish Forestry to be putting that forward, or is it something the industry would just take forward, which, as we've sort of alluded to earlier, might be a bit quicker than.
Yeah, I think the challenge in all of these things is, we've there's so much potential, there's so much opportunity. But I mean, at the moment, I'm developing the business plan for the organization for the coming year. And what's always the same every year is the things that we have to respond to, the things that we need to do, because government consultations, government policies. I was in Scottish Parliament yesterday for the second time in a couple of months, giving evidence. These suck up a lot of time, a lot of resource. And we're looking to do a C16 campaign. How can we get an industrial strategy? How can we get more timber being used? And I've got a team of 12 people working across the whole of the UK, some of whom are producing a magazine or just organising our membership and finances. It's such a small resource that, and the people at the end of the day who allow me to do the job I do and to work with the team I have, um, you know, they need to see value from the work that we do, and there's just more work than we're able to. So, which is a long plea on my behalf to say that there's ideas that we can have, and there's conversations that we can have, and I think those things which will lead to benefits. The challenge is then being able to find the ways to deliver that, and that's something that is Confor. There's only so much we can do. And ultimately, I need to focus on the priorities or not focus on, I have to identify the priorities and then focus on those priorities, because I need the people who, give me the money to exist, to keep giving me the money to exist. But if there are ways in which we can, agree,
Mm,
and this comes back to the evidence point, there are ways in which we can agree there's a need for something, and how
mhm,
do you frame what it is we're looking for and find the funding to be able to do it,
mm,
then, we're in a position to be able to use our leverage,
mhm.
to move things forward. But yeah, on this and so many other things, if I had three times as much staff,
Mhm.
we could do an awful lot more. But at the end of the day, it's very challenging.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, across the field, everyone is so pushed for time, aren't they? Yeah, I can relate to that. Maybe there's something with existing woodland that's as simple as because I've got kind of personal experience of this. If a community's got an idea that could be taken forward with a local woodland, that there's a mechanism where they can easily get in touch with somebody to take that forward. Because just the way the management owner structure is at the moment, and the way, if we're honest, land ownership is still a little bit opaque and difficult to disentangle in this country. Even just getting to have a conversation with the right person about a really simple project that probably no one would object to can be really tricky. So, maybe there's just something in that space that, um, you know, maybe it will improve over time with like land rights and responsibilities anyway. Maybe we're already in a situation where this sort of thing gets easier, and we've got the natural capital partnership pilot, so lose track of all the acronyms, that are hoping to facilitate some of that work. So, hopefully that's an avenue they can look at as well.
Yeah. I mean, one practical suggestion is we have a magazine which goes to all our members, and welcome an article which says, we'd be really interested in doing something in the space. Are there woodland owners out there who would like to get in touch? And yeah,
That's a great idea. We'll make that happen somehow. You can
yeah,
tell me your deadline for content offline. But I think with that, I mean, you've spoken for a really long time there. Really appreciate the conversation. I've really enjoyed it. It's been very insightful, and I hope everyone listening, wherever you are, has enjoyed it too. So a huge thank you, Stuart. A huge thank you to everyone who's listening. Don't forget, if you hit the subscribe button, you'll get notified when we release a new episode, whichever platform you're interacting with. And also let us know if you'd be interested in coming onto the podcast and having a conversation yourself, as well as feeling free to respond to any of the themes we've touched on, of course. So with that, thank you and bye for now.
thanks, Morag.
Thanks for listening. If something sparked a thought, a memory, or a bit of healthy friction, that's what we're here for. If you'd like to be part of a future conversation, please drop us a line. You can sign up to Forest Policy Group or support the work we do with a donation. It all helps to keep things moving forward. Until next time, take care.